Good evening, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I'm here to talk to you about what I see as one of the largest and most significant challenges that's going to face the world over the next 10 years, and this is commodity scarcity. In particular, I'd like to spend a bit of time talking to you about what China specifically is doing to basically put herself in a pole position to ensure that she becomes the winner that takes all. However, in order to do that effectively, I need to first put this in context. And I'd like to spend a few minutes talking to you about global demand for commodities, as well as global supply of commodities, so that you can appreciate the backdrop against which China is operating. Let me start by pointing out two facts. Since the financial crisis in 2008, in fact, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, commodity prices have increased by about 150%. The second point worth bearing in mind is since the 1990s, there have been at least 25 wars around the world that continue to rage around the world today, that continue to rage and are based and have their origins in commodity scarcity. Against this backdrop, China has devised a very systematic and deliberate plan to secure natural resources. Let me focus for a few minutes on the demand side. In particular, there are three key drivers that are driving the increase in demand for natural resources. The first and most important thing, I think, is just the population of the world. We've gone in just a short span of time from the 1960s, when there were 3 billion people on the planet, to where we are today, a situation we've got over 7 billion people on the planet, and we're forecasted to be as many as 9 billion on the planet by 2050. And only in 2100 will we expect that the population of the world will plateau out at around 10 billion. Today, the Indian population grows at 1 million people per month, and the world population is growing at 80 million people every single year, which is basically adding a new Germany every single year. Clearly, the pressures of that population growth puts emphasis and stress on natural resources. The second key driver that's affecting demand is wealth. And you might be sitting in New York saying, what the hell are you talking about? There's a massive recession. But out there in the emerging world, where 90% of the world's population lives, there's significant progress, significant economic growth, and a meaningful dent in poverty that's occurring. This pressure is expected to add 2 billion new people to the middle class by 2030, so just a short period away from today. Obviously, the demand for better quality foods, access to clean water, the ability to drive cars and have mobile phones will put significant pressure on natural resources. Finally, the third key driver of demand for natural resources is urbanization. If you travel to any metropole around the world, Mexico City, Lagos, Mumbai, or even Beijing, you'll know, and you probably will have seen, numerous people that are basically squeezed into conurbations, sitting on top of each other. This is very much the devised plan of many countries and policymakers in developing countries to ensure that they can deliver public goods to their populations. Why is this important? Well, to put it into context, in the United States, there are 9 cities that have 1 million people each. In Europe, there are 18 cities that have 1 million people each. In China today, there are nearly 100 cities with 1 million people each. By 2020, the Chinese government has an explicit plan that they've divulged to the world that they expect to have as many as 221 cities with 1 million people each and 8 cities with 10 million people each. The significance of this is something that is quite unfathomable if you live in places like Europe or the United States. These are the demand pressures. If I may spend a few moments very quickly going through the other side of the equation, which is the world supply. And I'm going to quickly go through arable land, access to clean water, energy, and minerals. On the point of arable land, today there are about 13 billion hectares of land on the planet. Only 11% of that land is actually arable, and that by that I mean actually we can grow crops, bearing in mind that we're competing with other species, but we'll also build our offices, our homes, and our living spaces on arable land. Arable land is depleting. Today, China, with 1.3 billion people, has 7% arable land. Africa, with about 1 billion people, has the most untilled arable land left on the planet. Secondly is water. 70% of the planet is water, and yet less than 1% of that water is actually accessible to us to drink because the other water is too salty for use, not even good enough for us to use to clean our toilets. When the next time you go into a McDonald's, do bear in mind that it takes 12,000 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of beef. How about that when you have a quarter pounder next time? The third key aspect on the supply side is energy. Now, sitting in the United States, there's all this euphoria about shale and how amazing it is. But people seem to forget a number of facts. Every single day, the world consumes 85 million barrels of oil every single day. The United States, with 350 million people, is the largest consumer of energy, consuming 20% of those 85 million barrels. In fact, the total consumption of Saudi Arabia and the total consumption of Russia is not enough to satiate the United States on one single day. China, with 1.3 billion people, consumes 10% of the world's energy. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that if the average Chinese converges to the levels of consumption of energy of the United States, it's a disaster waiting to happen. It's also worth pointing out that the next time you see a big headline saying there's been a new oil discovery, it's worth pointing out that all the discoveries of energy have largely been discovered already. I'll give you an example. The Brazilian government a couple of years ago came up with the idea that they had discovered 100 billion barrels of energy in a place called Tupi, offshore Brazil. The market sold off, so the price of oil went down, and there was lots of euphoria around this. It turned out, looking back, that that energy is under, the 100 billion barrels is under 2 miles of salt. And at the time, it was actually impossible for us to even access it. We did not have the technology. And today, they're still struggling to access it. So spare a thought the next time you hear about shale gas. The fact of the matter is that the revisions to the amount of access and the access of shale that's available are significantly being revised downwards, and the environmental considerations are enormous. Finally, around minerals, the concerns are that we have to go to much further and farther afield in order to access a lot of the minerals, particularly the ones that China wants. And in particular, China cares about copper. So you will recall the Chilean accident, but in places like Congo, DRC, and my own home country of Zambia, the terrain is very rough and is incredibly difficult places politically in order to get access, where you can get access for these resources. Clearly, the story I'm painting for you here is that demand and supply are out of balance. Whereas demand is skyrocketing, we're seeing a depletion and scarcity and increased finiteness of the natural resources on the supply side. Now, if I haven't suitably depressed you, I'd like to spend a couple of minutes talking to you about what specifically China is doing and why this is so important. China has adopted a three-pronged strategy in her very systematic and deliberate approach to securing natural resources. First of all, there's this idea of symbiosis. And by that, I mean China gives countries exactly what they want. I mentioned to you earlier that 90% of the world's population lives in the emerging world. In these countries, 60 to 70% of the population is under the age of 24. These governments are under immense pressure to deliver economic growth and meaningfully put dents in poverty in the shortest span of time. In order to do that, they need to increase trade, they need to ensure that they've got infrastructure built out, that they can have job creation, and that also people have access to foreign direct investment and capital to grow their businesses. Well, the Chinese have an app for that. They roll in and they provide the capital in order to do that. So it's a significant matter for governments in these countries, a significant reason why it is that they are enamored by the Chinese and they're willing to do business with them. The second key prong of the Chinese approach has to do with the fact that they've got deep pockets. This is no big secret. As you know, the Chinese are the largest foreign lender to the United States government. But across the world, they have lots of largesse, providing capital to many countries and many companies as well around the world. Well, their ability to write massive checks means that they have these massive utilities that are beyond just the capital cost of a mine or any of the investments that they make. Let me explain what I mean. If you go to Wall Street and you ask somebody to value a copper mine in Zambia, for example, they'll use a discounted cash flow model and they'll say to you, this mine is worth $100 million. But what you see happening is the Chinese roll in and they say, we're going to pay $500 million. Now, traditionally, what's happened to people on Wall Street is that they'll say, oh, those damn Chinese, they're so clueless. They don't understand how to value an asset. But the appropriate thing to do is to ask, what must be true that the Chinese would choose to pay 5 times or even more for an asset that we think is worth only 100 million? I believe, and through my experience and my travels, is that the Chinese get something that we don't. Their utility function is much broader than just the notional value of the mine. They understand that there's a political imperative for them to deliver economic growth and reduce poverty and to ensure that the industrialization process in their country continues. And a key pillar of that strategy is ensuring that they have access to natural resources, which is why they are determined to access those resources at whatever cost. The third key aspect of the Chinese campaign for resources is that China has become a monopsonist. A monopsonist is the opposite of a monopolist. A monopolist is a sole supplier. So, for example, you can have a utility company that provides electricity, but it's the only one in your town, and therefore you are held to pay the prices of those that utility decides to charge you. Well, a monopsonist is a key buyer. Think of Walmart in a place like Iowa. All those farmers producing corn or producing tomatoes, they have to, or they feel very much at the behest of what Walmart wants to accept as a payment for those for commodities. Well, China has become a monopsonist for many commodities. For example, copper and coal today, although they are market-driven, the real determinant of the price of copper on market exchanges has to do with how much demand is coming out of China. In concluding my speech, since I'm getting waved off in a minute here, I'd like to give you some live examples, because all of this might sound far too theoretical for you. And here are a whole range of examples. As we speak today, China is embarking on her largest transaction yet, which is the purchase of $15.1 billion transaction, a purchase right next door to the north of the United States in Canada. It's a company called Nexen, and the Chinese have been negotiating for a few months now to purchase that. Today, the largest recipient of foreign direct investment from China is Australia. In Brazil, to the south of the United States, for those of you who don't know where Brazil is, Brazil today has China as its largest investor and its largest trading partner. Russia, Kazakhstan, they've engaged in transactions, swap transactions, where they accept investment capital from China, and in return, they're willing to offer China full and, in some cases, perpetual access, into perpetuity, access to natural resources such as oil and uranium. Well, one of the interesting stories I've heard around water is that the Chinese have been in a wrangle with India for many years now, because they are trying to actually reroute a whole river. The Brahmaputra River is being rerouted by the Chinese to get access to clean water. My personal favorite is what China has done in Africa. The distance from Cape Town to Cairo, which is the southernmost point to North Point in Cairo, is 3 times the distance of New York to California. Today, I'm thrilled as an African to say that that distance is completely tarred, and that has happened over the past 15 years. You can drive it on all tarred road. It will take you through 15 countries, and it'll take you about 5 weeks. And that has been done by the Chinese. The reason that this is important is the next time you open a newspaper and you hear about neocolonialism, concerns about slave labor, and environmental concerns, do take a moment to think whether these are exaggerations or whether these things are actually occurring. In concluding my speech, I want to remind you that this whole suite of issues leads us to 2 very important things. First, I expect that commodity prices will rise. And before you say, oh, she's just a crazy crackpot, the IMF and the Energy Association for Oil and Energy Forecasts have both predicted that we will see $200 a barrel oil over the next decade. So significant increases, I should say, in energy, mainly supported by demand from China, but also from the emerging world in general. The second point, I'm afraid to say, is that I expect that there will be more wars and much more conflict around the natural resource depletion. The United States government last year, February 2012, put out a report claiming that they expect, forecasting in fact, that they expect that there'll be significantly more wars, particularly around water, but around many other energy concerns, such as oil and but also copper and other inputs into industrialization. To me, the short thing I would like to leave you with is buy energy. Thank you.